So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to ESMT Berlin. My name is Martha Ilbrock. I head communications and marketing today, and I'll lead you through our discussion. Hopefully, we will have time. I have seen the great presentation that our guests are going to show us today. I'm very excited to have ACRA here, the Analytical Credit Rating Agency. We have Kirill Lukashuk and Natalia Poyakova, who are going to present a little bit, or even, it's pretty deep, a lot about the Russian economy and the financial sector and what is happening, they're moved beyond the crisis, but what's going to happen in the future. What can we expect as the sanctions still do have an impact? As I'm sure most of you know, ESMT was founded in 2002 by some leading German industrial players, and we are an international business school, and we offer master's management and MBA programs, executive MBA programs, and a lot of executive education. So we have a lot of managers. Today, there's not a whole lot going on campus. Only our full-time MBAs are here, but some days it's full completely. You can't get into any room, which is very difficult for me when I'm trying to have events such as this. But we have about 3,300 managers who go through shorter programs here every year as well. Right here, we're in the State Council building of the former GDR. You may have recognized that there's a bit of socialist art on the walls. And this room, as far as I know, they've said used to be offices. I have a hard time imagining that with these high ceilings. But we turned this into two different multi-purpose areas last year. Very, very excited to have such great rooms to hold such events. So I'd like to get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Kirill Lukashuk is Senior Director and Head of Financial Institution Ratings Group at ACRA. He's responsible for analytical ratings coverage of the financial industry issuers and credit institutions, insurance and leasing companies. So he's going to go a little bit deeper into this in the kind of third part of their presentation. Kirill has been in the rating business since 2013. And he worked at the Moscow office of Standard & Poor and Gazprom's Rating Advisory Center. He started his career at the Banking Supervision and Regulation Department of the Bank of Russia after graduating from Moscow University of Finance and Law, majoring in banking and finance. So I think we have a banking expert here and someone with a lot of experience in the rating sector. Natalia Poyakova has led the Research and Forecasting Group at ACRA since 2016. And so she publishes regularly on macroeconomic and industry-specific forecasts. So she's going to look into the crystal ball for us a bit. I have a couple of questions for her if we have time in the end to see where's the future going to take us. Natalia graduated from Lomonosov Moscow State University in 2006, and she defended her PhD thesis in 2009. She also worked at the Gazprom Bank from 2012 to 2016 and was a chief expert for the energy sector there. So with no further ado, I would like to have you come up, Kirill. Thank you.
So thank you very much, colleagues. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are very glad to welcome you here today. First of all, I would like to express our gratitude to European School of Management and Technology for organizing this event. It's great. Together with my colleague Natalia, we will describe you here the key trends and prospects of Russian economy and financial sector. We represent young, relatively young, but rapidly developing credit rating firm called ACRA, Analytical Credit Rating Agency. And before we start with analytics, let me briefly describe what ACRA is. So ACRA was founded in November 2015. Creation of our agency was a direct consequence of comprehensive reform of rating industry in Russia, with the transferring of supervision activities from the Ministry of Finance to the Bank of Russia. It was not a response to sanctions or other, political stuff of business. It's a purely economically driven decision. For example, all offices of big three rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, still continue its operations in Moscow and Russia, and has absolutely no problem with rating activities. Despite the fact that our activity started only in September 2016 after the authorization in Bank of Russia as our regulator. At the moment, we can show significant market share in core sectors of Russian economy. We believe it's a result of both market recognition and internal operational efficiency. To be fully independent and to comply with a world-class credit rating business experience, our shareholder structure consists of 27 entities with a 3.7 stake each. We are not controlled by the government or by the central bank. As you may see on the slide, our shareholders are from different sectors of Russian economy, banking, industry, even media companies there. The next level of our independent corporate governance is the board of directors composition. All of them are independent, except CEO, of course, and represent EU, US, and EMEA financial business with significant experience within rating firms and prominent professional services firms. You can see Carl Johansson, Thomas Misong, Anwar Hassoun, Ekaterina Trofimova is our CEO, ex-S&P, and Vincent Truglia. From the very beginning of ACRA, we decided to build our firm on the basis of key strategic principles. Our goal is not to become a national champion, but to act as a credible provider of Russian credit risk information to international investors. To achieve it, we hired experienced best-class professionals from industry and also from big three agencies. As Martha mentioned, I'm from Standard & Poor's and Ekaterina Trofimova from Standard & Poor's as well. We also have guys from Moody's and from Fitch as well. And we invest a lot in education, in annual education of our employees. So our routine activities in corporate governance are constructed in such a way to achieve the maximum independence and not to comply with all the requirements of the central bank. I'm proud to say that we are on the right way, I think. In the second half of last year, we were asked to participate in more than 50 meetings with top-tier international institutional investors from EU, US, and Asia. We comment major news and trends for Bloomberg raters, economists, and I hope Deutsche Welle as well today. Speaking about our criteria, to be short and briefly, we try to meet all Basel, ESMA, and the local regulatory standards. All our methodologies are public and disclosed on our website. Very important milestone of our credit rating activity is based on our national scale, Russian national scale. It allows us to compare entities, banks within the Russian Federation without factoring any country or sovereign risk. It's not only a strict requirement by the regulator, but this allows us to provide more granularity to our analysis and to assessing better the level of probability of default in Russian economy. So, given our current criteria toolbox, we cover financial institutions, all types, corporates, local governments, and structured finance deals as well. In the end of this part, I want to mention that we try to build not only the rating firm, but to construct so-called ACRA ecosystem in order to develop all kinds of credit risk analysis in Russia. To achieve it, we do commercial research. My colleague Natalia is in charge of this business. Rating models validation tools, trainings on credit analysis. This is a really rare thing in Moscow these days. All of these activities are subject to approval from the regulator in order to comply with the regulation and with no violation of conflict of interest principles. Finally, we're looking forward to international development and waiting some good news from EU side. From Asian side of the world, we already signed a memorandum of cooperation between ACRA and Chinese Golden Credit Rating Agency for joint analytical work and information sharing. So from here, I want to pass my word to Natalia and the world of macroeconomics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirill. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad that you're here, not outside where the weather is so pleasant. And let's look at Russian economy, which is so popular now, unfortunately. I have printed out for you our last update of Russian economy outlook, which we released only a few days ago. And actually, you can find all our research on our website in English or in Russian if you if you know. Access is free for all our research papers. And so, Russian economy last year returned to growth after 3-year recession. This recession was driven by oil price plunge and sanctions. In our outlook, we expect that Russian economy will grow by 1.5% in the midterm. It's not fast growth, it's slow growth. And what do we see in our crystal ball? We see key 5 trend, which, as we expect, will affect more Russian economy development in the midterm. They are, first, population aging. Yes, it's a very common trend for all developed countries, for Germany. All our population are becoming more gray. But why it's so important for a Russian economy in the midterm? Because this common global trend of aging in Russia now is enhanced by extremely low birth rate in Russia in 90s after Soviet Union collapse. And now people, generation born in 90s, very small generation, is entering labor market and can't substitute retiring generation on 50s. And yes, labor force in Russia is shrinking now. And just imagine, only for last year, our labor force fell by 1 million people. And it's very hard to grow fast when your population is aging and labor force is shrinking. The second, low inflation. Inflation in Russia last year was 2.5%. I understand that it's not low rate for Germany, but believe me, it's extremely low rate for Russia because in 90s, inflation rate was triple digital, average inflation rate in Russia. Last decade, average inflation rate was double digital. We used to live in high inflation environment for decades, and therefore it's really something new for us. And we should adapt to this new environment because in some ways, of course, it's very good news because credits are cheaper and environment more predictable, but in some ways, for business and for government, it's harder to balance deficit and other sheets under high inflation, under low inflation. So the third, budget austerity. Russian government is eager to get away from oil dependency of Russian budget revenues. And so we expect that budget expenditure in the midterm will fall. Fourth, my Chinese style dress means nothing, but Russia turns to east, and we see increase of Asia in Russian export, Russian import in foreign direct investments and even in debt. And of course, it's not good news for European business because, for example, in case of increasing share of Asian import, Asian import, more cheaper import, now is substituting European, more expensive import, especially in machinery. And now more than half of import of machinery goes to Russia from Asia. And here European business is losing share in Russian market. And the fifth, unfortunately, sanctions. Sanctions are still expanding, and on Friday, new sanctions were unveiled. And on Friday, first time when sanctions were imposed on private-owned company, Rusal, because before we had seen only sanctions on state-owned companies or small private-owned companies, but not so large as the leading aluminium producer, Rusal. And yes, we expect that sanctions will not be lifted in the midterm. But actually, Russian financial system has already adopted those sanctions. Today, we see high volatility, but on Russian market after Friday sanctions, but not very harmful as it was before. And maybe where sanctions has not been adopted, oil and gas sector. And sanctions will restrain oil production in Russia in next decade, of course. Yes, and it's negative trend for our economy. And so here, as I mentioned, two key restraints for economic growth in Russia: shrinking labor force and increase in import price after ruble depreciation in 2014. And what Russian government is going to do with this shrinking labor force? What do you guess? As I know, retirement age is raising now in Germany. Yes, retirement age. And after presidential election, retirement age increase is the most expected reform in Russia. Retirement age in Russia is very low in comparison with Germany. And how do you think, what retirement age for women in Russia? 55? Yes, 50, yes, 55. I guess it's very low, 55, and for men 60. And now everybody is expecting that government will raise retirement age. But even in this case, this negative trend will not be offset, but this increase in retirement age and labor force will fall anyway. Here is decomposition of economic growth potential in Russia. Why do we expect so slow midterm growth? Shrinking labor force will contribute negatively to economic growth in Russia. And the most positive contribution we can see in case of productivity and efficiency. And Russian economy is very inefficient. And actually, in some way, I think that inefficiency is our main competitive advantage because a lot can be done in this case. And now Russian economy is working close to its potential. Unemployment is low, is about 5%, and natural unemployment 4%. And utilization rate, capacity utilization rate is very high. Of course, situation is different in different sectors, and many car sectors are standing idle, but the average capacity utilization is very high, and therefore it's a very it's reason why Russian central bank is conducting so tough monetary policy and not conducting easing monetary policy like European Central Bank of American Fed. As I mentioned, one of the most impressive trend in Russian economy now is low inflation. It was achieved by extremely tough monetary policy. The Russian Central Bank started inflation targeting in 2015 when inflation was double digital, and now inflation target is 4, and last year inflation was less than 3%. And less than 3, and now inflation in Russia is less than inflation in the UK or even in the United States. Last 2 years, it was years of dramatic decrease in rates in Russian economy, and now this cycle of decreasing rate is almost over. And Russian Central Bank is near its target. And the Russian Central Bank announced that target for key rates is 6-7%. And maybe it's interesting why the Russian Central Bank sees target for key rate as 6-7%, because this 6-7% the Russian Central Bank sees as neutral rate, and it's very important for European countries as well, because after years of quantitative easing, in some years, the European Central Bank will start seeking neutral rate as well, not easing but neutral. And the Russian Central Bank sees neutral rate as inflation, 4% plus parity cost of money abroad. And now the Russian Central Bank sees as 2.5% Fed rates plus country risk. But we expect that this target will be decreased in midterm, and maybe in 2020 we will see key rate in Russia less than 6%. Yes, inflation has fallen in Russia to historic lows, but anyway, it's very important to understand that this rate is much more volatile than, for example, in Europe. but the population is poorer, and therefore much more goods in a customer basket depends on volatile factors such as FX rate or food price. And therefore, yes, we expect that inflation in Russia will be about 4% in the midterm, but we take in account that this can be affected by volatile factors. And maybe a very strange issue when I mentioned that this low inflation is a challenge for Russian business. If you get involved in Russian business in some ways, have you noticed that during crisis, for example, during crisis of 2008, 2009, unemployment wasn't so severe problem in Russia as it was in European countries. Why? When inflation is high, your revenues of your business or revenues of government budget is growing just because price is growing. And to balance budget, you just can say your staff, oh, it's hard times, please wait, we raise your salary a bit later, next year. And this year, under high inflation, you will gain because your revenue is growing just because prices are growing. And under high inflation, business and government are much more flexible to crisis. And now, low inflation in Russia is a real new environment, and here efficiency is only option, especially for industries focused on local markets such as banking, infrastructure, trade. We, on our website, on daily basis, we release our own index, ACRA Financial Stress Index, to estimate financial stability in Russia. And here I can show you that actually financial stability in Russia has returned to pre-crisis level, and financial sanctions mainly has absorbed. Of course, it's very important for particular entities, but in macroeconomic view, we don't see any sanctions-driven volatility on Russian financial market, at even, for example, Russian government sovereign bonds yield now are even lower than it was in 2013. And maybe continuing the sanctions issue, I'd like to show you this slide to explain why actually financial sanctions has been absorbed. Actually, the share of debt vulnerable to sanctions in Russia is not very high, and now it's only 13% before, on average. Before sanctions, it was 15%. Russia doesn't depend on foreign financing much, and therefore now it's of course for particular entities to sanctions was very harmful. And today we can see effect on Russian Rusal, and it's very hard. But for the whole economy, yes, it's vulnerable, but Russia can absorb this sanctions on debt. And maybe much more harmful will be effect of sanctions on oil and gas, because now any supply of equipment for offshore projects, for oil and gas, for offshore oil and gas projects in Russia from European and American countries are banned. And now oil production in Russia is growing, and it will be growing next 3-4 years, because this growth is determined by investment made in 2010, 2013. But in the 20s, of course, we will see this negative effect in oil production, in stagnation in oil production in Russia. I printed out for you our last update, economic update in Russian economy, and how Russian government intends to raise economic, to push up economic growth in Russia. Investments. Now investments is the main priority, and stimuli for investment is the main priority. And actually there are a lot of stimuli for investment in Russia today, and a lot of unsaturated markets, and on global market, Russian producer is very competitive due to Russian currency depreciation in 2014. And there are a lot of opportunities for import substitution. And I know that German business is continuing to invest here, and one of the largest projects is new Mercedes factory. There are a lot of underinvestment in infrastructure and demand for new investments, and great demand for efficiency improvements. Maybe the only constraint that investors usually makes decision about investment not forward-looking, but maybe backward-looking, seeing on performance in these industries. And of course, now performance in all Russian industries are worse than it was a couple years ago, before crisis, and it constrains investors from investment in Russia. And this slide about stimuli and a slide about risk. This specific risk for 2018, and here I invite you for discussion with this answer. Maybe you have your own ideas, but a bit later. And now I give opportunity to Kirill share with you views on Russian banking systems.
So thanks, Natalia. Let's talk about Russian financials. As you can see on this slide, we have probably the best coverage of Russian financial industry in ACRA. We have more than 50 ratings assigned and several ratings with a private status. You know, our client has the right to decide whether to go public with its rating or not, if it's not okay with the expectations of the client. This is not a simple figure. This allows us to have quite good analytical coverage of the system. The figure is around 80% in terms of banking assets. So our analytical findings, we do think, are quite reliable. So let's start with banks and leasing companies. It may seem that Russian banking system and Russian banks are in a fairly comfortable environment. Indeed, GDP is growing and some sectors require new lending. Financial system is far away from stress. Natalia showed our FSI index dynamics. But I'll show you today that it is not so and so straight. They think that there are three major strategic threats for Russian banking industry. First of all, it's net interest margin pressure, asset quality, and last one, competition. I'll describe you these trends in details on the next slides. So probably let's start with our expectations of the sector growth. They believe that due to poor performing economy with low growth prospects, banking system will result in single-digit growth for next years, and the long-run growth will be the same. It's not good in terms of the source of growth for the economy. Natalia mentioned about investments, and at the moment we can say that Russian banking system is a factor of new credit in economy to support its growth. First strategic threat is competition. We had several the most interesting slides. I think this is one of them. So the most interesting situation that government stake in the entire banking system has risen to 70% by early 2018 versus 63% at the early 2017. This figure is among the highest among all industries in the Russian market. For example, government owns 66% of the oil and gas sector. So financial sector is a champion in this dynamics. Is it bad or is it good? We think that this situation is associated with certain risks, and as a result of imperfect management of investments from the government as a shareholder of these banks, kind of regulatory forbearance, and cases of directed lending, politically driven lending to certain industries, they think that it finally comes with an increased amount of contingent liabilities of the budget and the Bank of Russia in terms of banking system support in case of need. I remind you 2 or 3 years ago, after the first sanctions shock and economy shock in Russia, government spent around 1.5 trillion rubles to support Russian banking system. At the moment, share of the state in the system has risen, so the amount of potential support will be higher. Second strategic risk is asset quality. So how do we assess the asset quality of rated institutions? We perform loan-by-loan analysis of top 30 largest exposures on the balance sheet of our rated banks, and coming out with a figure of classical figure of NPLs 90+ and so-called problem loans, restructured loans, or the loans granted to borrowers with a weak performance and over-leveraged borrowers. Our assessment is that at the moment the figure of problem loans in Russian banking system is around 15%. Is it quite high? It's high figure, but more important that you should look at the situation with certain banks. The second interest slide, the most interest slide in my presentation, it's the picture of real rated banks without names, of course, not to violate the conflict of interest and all other corporate governance principles. It's interesting that the gray line is the official figure of audited statements of the problem loans on the balance sheet. The second line is our assessment of the problematic assets on the balance sheet. The most interesting picture is on the right. These banks are both state-owned and privately owned. On the left side of the graph, there are banks with they are subs of European and the US global financial groups. It's interesting. So I'll remind you that the gray line is audited statements. More important that in terms of provisioning and coverage of this problematic loans by reserve situation is not so good. We have only half of problematic loans well backed by provisions, and this situation describes us that in case of any stress, the shortfall on the capital will be significant. We divided our analysis within 3 groups of banks: state-owned, privately owned, and subsidiaries of foreign banks. Really interesting picture. In terms of problem loans, outperformers, privately owned banks are outperformers. But if you look at hidden areas of risk in terms of high-risk industries lending and related party lending, state-owned banks show probably worse situation. They think these are areas of hidden problems in future. In this situation, they think that Russian banking system is in situation of kind of growth trap. So to boost your revenues, you need to grow, but your problems are not so well provisioned as it might be. This is why, in case of aggressive growth scenario boosted by government intentions or whatever reasons, the capital buffer of Russian banking system will be less that we have now, and this is area of potential risk in future. Next strategic threat is net interest margin pressure, and this situation is a result of low interest rate environment in economy, as Natalia mentioned, and banking system probably in the worst position among all industries in Russia in terms of effect of this situation. We were surprised by results of fourth quarter of last year. We had only 1 year of net interest margin recovery of Russian banking system. It was 2016, after the shock of oil price drop and sanctions imposed in 2014. We believe that on the back of asset liability structure of Russian banks and further decrease of the level of interest rates in the economy, Russian banking will lose the income source coming from the net interest margin and its core banking activity. As a result, if you look at financial result of Russian banking, we think that it's quite bad if you're an equity investor, because in terms of return on assets and return on equity, we will have quite stable situation with a 1% average return on assets in next 3 years. Some points regarding regulatory innovations. As you probably heard or read in press, last year central bank introduced new mechanics of financial rehabilitation practice in Russia. Previously, system was absolutely inefficient. I remind you, the central bank granted loans on the below the market interest rate to the healthy banks, and after that, healthy banks, they invested their money in failed institutions and tried to rehabilitate in their situation. But as a result, Bank Открытие, Pромsvyazbank, and BIN Bank, the most prominent cases of failed institutions in last year, all these banks were senators. They rehabilitate other institutions, and hopefully central bank decided to change the system, and now they created the fund of consolidation owned by the central bank, and they decided to invest directly to the capital of failed institutions and manage the situation by itself. This is one of the results because of increased level of the government in the capital of Russian banking system. And I should mention that the final target is okay. They are going to sell these institutions to the market after they reinvest their capital and rebuild their business model. Looks like good, but we don't have any one success story of fully privatization case in Russian financial industry to the date. Absolutely. So we have talks regarding Sberbanks, regarding the VTB for ages, but still these banks are state-owned, and due to sanctions story, we have concerns that the high level of share of the state in the system will stay for ages, for, I don't know, in best scenario, 5 to 7 years, we will have the situation as I described. I mentioned the major cases of failed institution, key implicators for investors, for debt investors. Size doesn't matter. I remind you, Открытие was among the top 5 Russian banks in the system at all. Junior creditors face material risks. Central bank decided not to pay to sub-debt holders, and legally speaking, they are correct. They decided not to be social oriented by to provide strict policy in terms of the risks of sub-debt holders, including in the banking capital. Audited statements is only a well-drawn picture. Unfortunately, I showed the slide with the difference between the problem loans assessment and the audited statements assessment of NPLs. Bank goes to default when the regulator wants. For sure, all the market participants knew the situation with Открытие. This is its financial position and problems. But central bank probably had not enough instruments and not enough power to intervene. They waited for 3 years and then intervened to these institutions. And it's not enough to be over-liquid to survive for even large Russian bank. Coming back to other entities in the Russian financial market, leasing business. In contrast with the banking activities, volumes of leasing operations are growing very well, and we expect all-time record of new leasing volumes with the growth rates of 15%. Key reason, absence of regulation and specific sector specialization in aviation and other state support sectors. Probably regulator found these figures of growth too aggressive and decided to intervene and to implement new regulation to the leasing market in next years, and this will be key topic for Russian leasing companies in next years. Insurers. Here, good news. We believe that insurer markets growth to outpace the GDP growth in medium term. Reasons: low penetration of insurance services in Russia, active development of life insurance business on the back of population aging and monetary policy to support rapid growth of life insurance if you compare with the deposit rates level. Car sales also will be the contributor for strong growth. Now the bad story. In short term, we think that most pronounced risks are connected with the obligatory motor third-party liability crisis. this segment failed so far and failed to curb the losses and loss-making trend for insurers. And they think that in next 2 to 3 years, segment might be stable, but policyholders of this type of insurance will be growing disappointed by their results, and this risk could be the same in investment life insurance as well. At the same time, from the cross-sectoral point of view, insurance sector return on equity will be among the highest in the Russian economy, and the potential of the new investments is high in other view. Last story, but not the least, asset managers and funds. This story is short but sharp. General trend in asset management industry in Russia is growing. The growth basis is pension savings. We see some potential in open-ended mutual funds and individual asset management activities because of, again, low rates on deposits in the economy, in the banking system. In pension system, we expect insurance pensions number to increase and expect increasing transfer of pension activities from the state-owned pension fund of Russia to non-state pension funds. Overall, Russian financial and pension system grew from 3.9 trillion rubles to 5.4 trillion rubles in second quarter of last year. And it was a record and a significant moment for entire pension industry. So the total volumes in non-state part of industry was ahead of state-owned part of it. As a conclusion of my story, I think you probably now understand that key risks of Russian banks associate with net interest margin, asset quality, and competition. Sub-debt of Russian banks is probably at risk. Leasing market regulation is coming. Insurance market is interesting in terms of equity investments, in our view. And pension market is growing, and there's further potential on the back of low rates in the economy. So thank you very much for your time. We are happy to answer all your questions, and we think that our Russian market is one of the most dynamic and interesting in the world. We are representing its market, and feel free to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting, and it was such a large amount of information that I want to ask 1 or 2 questions, and then I would like to open up to the floor. So my first question, I think, would be more for you. So you say the government is consolidating, expenditures are declining. Where do you see which sector is going to have the most growth in 2018, 2019? So I want the crystal ball again.
Regarding this trend to squeeze of government role in Russian economy, of course, it means decrease in spending and will affect negatively personal income and personal income for the poorest population of Russia. But on the other hand, it means that Russian government will give more opportunities for private business. And for example, as Kirill mentioned, insurance. Russian government still act as insurance company in Russia. For example, in any tragedy, fire, accident, aircraft, terrorist attack, Russian government pay, not insurance company pay for these losses. And it give room for private sector, for example, insurance. Of course, it's very difficult to answer what sector shows the fastest dynamics. Of course, I guess it will be something new about IT as usual. But of course, this decrease in government spending, one of the most powerful stimuli for business, for private business in Russia now.
Thank you, Natalia. So I have one question for you as well, Kirill, because I was looking at your slides beforehand. I had the chance to go through them this weekend, and then there's one statement that you showed the slide, but it didn't come out quite so much, but it's that ACRA sees the new regulatory instruments positively around banking regulation, but the effectiveness has to be tested. How long do you think this will take? I mean, what do you think? Do you think there's going to be like a bank is going to then go bust and we'll see what happens? Or?
Yeah, it's clear. When we're talking about the regulation, we're looking at 2 points. So first of all, it's protection of system. So imagine the situation that one of the largest financial institutions, security in Russia, failed and central bank decided not to intervene, not to support. My expectation that the level of ACRA's financial stress index will be among the highest in history because, in terms of deposits amount on its balance sheets, it's close to 1 trillion rubles. It's a really significant amount, and state will face bank run on the system, and system won't be protected. So from this point of view, we view these measures are positive. On the other hand, if we are talking about reform, new regulation, we're talking about transparency. And this should be tested because, they said that they're going to invest, they're going to manage. But now we read the press and we don't have any public comment on the certain amount of problematic assets within the banking group. For me, it's strange because you as a regulator, you intervened. Please come with the exact figure and describe the situation. I think in terms of transparency, a lot should be done.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Please say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, my name is Thomas Pfanne. I think it was yesterday that Nezavisima Gazeta published a so-called Trump-Putin plan frightening the oligarchs out of the United States and out of London. I didn't feel anything has been said about the positive effects of sanctions. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Positive. Of course, everything has balance, positive and negative, and usually we are talking about negative aspects. Of course, we can find some positive sides of sanctions. For example, in 2014, Russia banned food import from Europe, and it's really has helped Russian agriculture, and Russian agriculture sector is booming now because it's closed with high tariff, with ban from European food import, and actually now the share of import on Russian food market, it's so small, so low, because of course something we have to import oranges and pineapples and so on, but in case of even cheese, for example, it was in this, of course, sanctions affected food producer in good way, but I guess it's the only good example. In other cases, more negative sides than positive.
But if the billions don't get invested into London anymore or New York as such, then they might be tempted to come back to Russia.
Maybe yes. But it's tricky question. It's very tricky question. If we see this comeback and if this money will be invest in Russian economy, because of course it's not so easy, and there are many other places where you can invest your money, not only in Russia.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm Munif Barakat, an ESMT alumni. I'm not from the banking sector, so I need your help to build the little link that I'm struggling with. So you spoke about the inflation rate that's fell down below 5% with such an impressive, let's say, progress in the last 5 years. At the same time, the ruble, if I take the euro-ruble exchange rate, it jumped from 40 rubles to 70. Let's say today is probably 72 rubles. So probably for the same thing, you're paying 100% more for your imports. So if there's a major, you're importing starting from cheese, as you say, ending with machinery, cars, airplanes, whatever like you need for the economical growth in Russia. So how do these two things play? I would expect inflation to raise at the same time.
Please me clarify, what do you mean? How it's balanced between high ruble depreciation and low inflation? Okay, let me show you the slide. Oh, it's two. Here you can see the composition of inflation rate in Russia. And for 2014, for 2015, you may see how ruble depreciation affected inflation rate in Russia. And actually, it was main driver of inflation shock in Russia. And yes, in 2014, Russian currency fell twice, and import fell twice as well. And of course, it pushed up inflation to 15%, yes, per year. But the Russian central bank was very efficient in its monetary policy. The Russian central bank increased the key rate in the end of 2013 to 17% to curb inflation rate. And actually, to last year, key rate, the central bank key rate was above inflation by 5% in real terms. For example, right now, key rate is more than 7% and inflation less than 3%. Difference about 5%, and therefore ruble assets are now very popular among investors, among foreign investors, despite any sanctions. And this tough monetary policy has helped to curb inflation to these low rates. And for example, easing monetary policy in the Europe now is to push up inflation. And this all was about this tough monetary policy and high key rates.
Thank you. So I think we have two questions here in the front.
Hello. I am working in the pharmaceutical industry, so with the healthcare sectors, and you touched a little bit on the low birth rate and the stagnating population numbers. And I think you are quite right. I mean, and I don't see why this should change in the short term. Because everything that is related in Russia with the healthcare is expensive and an out-of-the-pocket market for anybody, and insurance is not very popular there. But anyway, with this, I would like to indirectly have a question there. I mean, there is still a project of this common tariff union with countries like Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and that it's supposed to create a bigger market, also bigger market for Russian companies, and and also many foreign companies are investing in Russia because they have the perspective that from Russia they can cover also the markets in these other countries. Do you see any perspective that this will be really realized, this project? Because for me it is more like public statements, but no practical steps into this direction. And if it will be realized, will it be really will it cost, or will it Russia cost more money, or will it bring money to Russia?
Now Russia is developing a free trade zone with Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Armenia, and now it's one of priority. And Kazakhstan benefits from this union more than Russia, but anyway, yes, we are designing this project. There are some problems, of course, with tariffs. But anyway, if you are working in the healthcare industry, when Marta asked about the most growing industry in the midterm, I guess that healthcare will be among them because population is aging and more demand for healthcare products, and also, but Russian government is eager to attract investors to Russia, and a lot of programs in healthcare now is claiming from you to be localized in Russia, to participate in different government programs. And yes, I guess maybe, I don't know why for you this union story is so important, because of course in this union the Russian market is the largest. And
Two more remarks regarding insurance. You mentioned life insurance. Yes, so in the last 3 years, life insurance almost doubled in terms of amount. Yes, it's low base, but again. And second remark, more and more people in Russia understand that even in case their medicine care is for free from the government, it's not for free in reality. This is why they pay more to privately owned business, healthcare business. And I see this situation day to day in my family, in my friends, and this is a trend. So yes, we have public free medicine, but in reality, and this is a potential.
I'm Konstantin Korotov. I'm a professor here at the ESMT. So just you mentioned that one of the untapped opportunities is the low productivity rate, labor productivity rate. So what are, in your opinion, the factors that can contribute to the increase of the productivity, labor productivity in Russia? So what may be the measures that are being undertaken or could be undertaken in the Russian Federation in order to increase the productivity? And what might be the social consequences of that? Because one of the positive sides of low productivity is the low unemployment rate. Yeah, we know that people are employed at extremely low wages. They say they go to work, they earn peanuts, but basically, technically, for the state statistics, basically, it looks extremely good. Now that the elections are over and there's no longer huge risk of people not voting correctly if they are losing their jobs, or theoretically there might be some opportunities there. But basically, what are some of the other options beyond basically eliminating some of the low productivity jobs that can increase the labor productivity in Russia?
It's very difficult to increase labor productivity with any measures, and only evolution in this issue. Because of course we know that labor productivity in Russia is very low, and even we have a joke, but all joke is partially a joke, that we have shadow men unemployment among men that are working in police, and we have shadow women unemployment in accounting departments, because our tax regime very complicated, sophisticated, and nobody want to make it less sophisticated because because this shadow women unemployment. But only evolution. But now there are a lot of stimuli for this increase in labor productivity, because labor force is shrinking, and we need additional labor force, and we can't substitute this decrease in labor force by flow from other CIS countries by migrants, because CIS country has the same problems about low birth rate in 90s. And yes, there are a lot of stimuli now to increase labor productivity, because economy is not growing fast. And in 2000, economy was growing very fast by 6-7% per year, and nobody cared about productivity. And now the only option is efficiency, and I guess it would be organic process. And actually, I don't know how to improve productivity with government measure. It's very difficult.
So we have. Do you have a comment to that, or we had one more question? And I have lots more questions, but we're going to have to wrap it up. Let's take these last three questions, and then we will wrap it up.
Marcus Kerber from Berlin Technology University. I have two questions, if you allow me. First of all, addressed to the lady. I would like to have your prognosis as to what would make the Russian economy more competitive in a, let's say, middle range. How would this be possible without what we have in Germany as the machine tool industry, which is the trigger for almost everything? How can this be implanted in the Russian economy, which has a high potential? How can it be implanted without coming from outside? Let's say outside, certainly not from Kazakhstan or from Ukraine, perhaps from Ukraine. I would like to have your recommendation of what should be done in terms of policy in order to give the Russian economy in fields where there's not an energy overload, a competitive edge. The second question addressed to you. Thank you very much for both of you to this extremely impressive professional presentation of the state of the Russian economy. But if I see the financial structure, I ask myself two questions. On one hand, I admire the way Russia buffers the effects of the sanctions through a banking sector which has a certain state overload, let's put it this way, which translates into some very risky commitments, which you showed. The state-owned banks seem to be more inclined to assume difficult risk. So in a way, there is a dilemma. On one hand, the state-owned sector stabilizes the Russian economy and prevents collapses or something close to a collapse. On the other hand, structurally, in the long run, we have risk which is not extremely sustainable. What policy recommendation would you make, if you could, in order to overcome that situation which in the long run is not sustainable, neither in economic, nor in structural, nor in political terms? Thank you.
So let's take the other two questions before we get started. I'm taking notes. So we have here, if you would, I'm sorry, now my colleague's going there, and you will wrap it up for us.
Привет. Just a quick question. in your predictions for the future, you made no specific, well, you left no room for what would happen if sanctions possibly might be at some point lifted, if ever they might come to an agreement of sorts about Crimea and Ukraine and Donetsk. What consequences, both positive and negative, on these figures could it have? So both balance of trade and growth, perhaps just some ideas.
And let's take the last question, and then we'll put them all together right here. No, here.
Okay, I wanted to make a remark on the low productivity issue you mentioned. Of course, if you look at the per capita income in purchasing power parity compared to Germany, it's just half of it of that of Germany. So it's really very low. And if I have looked at your numbers, even if you look at the TFP, with 1.5%, you will need a century or more to catch up to the German level as it is now. This is not a very good perspective. And one reason, I think, of course, is something similar like in China exists iron rice bowl. There's a Russian iron rice bowl that you don't dare to dismiss people who are idle and inefficient employed, and then you are in a low productivity trap, whatever you do. Yeah, and but it's a social revolution to change this. You see it also in other countries. Look in France now, when Macron tries to break up certain lock-in positions, then you risk strikes, social unrest, and things like that. But there is no way out to improve the efficiency of a country when you keep the rights of those as they are intact. It wouldn't work. Yeah.
I don't think that what you had said was too much different. So we have the regulatory questions. So financial or competition. What regulation can you put your recommendation? Would you make? Are you allowed to make a policy recommendation?
Technically, we are not allowed to
that's
give recommendation, but yes, in general, yes.
Regarding competitive advantages, actually, after ruble depreciation in 2014, Russian economy became so competitive. Labor costs are the same as in Chinese cities. Electricity price are among the lowest in the world. And yes, regarding costs, Russia now is very competitive. But what we should do to make it more competitive, because actually many investors who under this remaining competitiveness in cost started designing plans to export products from Russia to Europe, for example. They face challenges because Russia doesn't have free trade agreements, for example, with other countries, and really, and now not WTO makes sense, but these free trade agreements between countries, and it was a real barrier for many European car producers, for example, which localized production in Russia before crisis. And I guess what we can do in different barrier in export opportunities for business. And also there are a lot of bottlenecks in infrastructure, but it's much more capital intensive and more expensive. And I guess these free trade agreements, it's maybe much more useful.
And in finances?
Yeah. My recommendation is to change the way of thinking from the government people to more investment-oriented people. What I mean exactly? Set clear, public and transparent target to the state-owned bank. Fire the management team if they fail to achieve it. And don't ask to make related party lending. Be as a private investor, and you will have 25 ROE in next 5 to 7 years. We have excellent example of Sberbank, for example, with a impressive ROE with a good asset quality, state-owned institution, but driven by investment stimulus, not by the government. Act as its shareholder, as its investor for the rest of the system. It's simple for me.
The very, very last question then was, yeah, what if sanctions are lifted?
Oh.
So let's look into our crystal ball. I think it's a great way to end this wonderful session. I'd like to thank you both now, but what will happen?
It's so complicated question because actually in 2014, 2015, we made a scenario if sanctions would be lifted. But now we even don't make any prediction in this case because it's so tricky. Actually, I don't think that we will see fast positive effects because yes, in 2014, a recession started in Russia, economic recession, after oil price plunge and sanctions. But actually, slowdown in Russian economy started not in 2014, but in 2012, I guess, because all driver of economic growth in 2000 stopped working, and this restraints, these constraints of population aging and high utilization rate are still there, and therefore, of course, we will see capital inflow in Russia, and of course, ruble, Russian currency, I guess, will grow, but I guess it's not. We can't. We don't. We will not see faster economic growth than I show on my slide.
Thank you both so much. Then I won't even try to sum it up. You gave us so much food for thought. Would it be possible for us to put your slides online? Or?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we will put them online under the ESMT event, under About ESMT, or the School and Networks part. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you a lot for question. And
Thank you very much.
we invited you in Moscow for football championship.